Today, high heels are one of the most recognizable symbols of women's fashion. Millions of people see them as something that was always connected to beauty, elegance, and female style. But that story is completely wrong. The first people who made high heels famous were not women at all. They were men. Not only men, but soldiers, horse riders, noblemen, and some of the most powerful rulers on earth. For hundreds of years, a man wearing high heels was not considered unusual. In many places, it was a sign of status, wealth, and power. The higher your position in society, the more likely you were to be seen wearing them. And that raises a strange question. If high heels began as men's footwear, then how did they become one of the most famous items in women's fashion? The answer takes us far away from modern fashion shows and luxury stores. It begins with a practical problem that had nothing to do with beauty, a problem faced by men riding horses at high speed, carrying weapons, and fighting for their lives. What started as a simple solution to that problem would leave the battlefield, enter royal palaces, reshape ideas about power, and eventually transform fashion across the world. Along the way, kings used heels to display authority, wealthy elites turned them into status symbols, and entire societies changed their idea of what men and women should wear. The strangest part is that the shoe itself barely changed. What changed was the world around it. And once you see how that happened,
you will never look at a pair of high heels the same way again. If you ask most people who high heels were invented for, they will probably give the same answer. They will say women. They will say fashion. They will say beauty. The answer feels so obvious that almost nobody stops to question it. High heels appear in magazines, luxury stores, fashion advertisements, and red carpet events. They have become so connected to women's fashion that many people assume this was always their purpose. The strange part is that almost every part of that story is wrong. High heels did not begin as a women's fashion item. They did not become popular because women demanded them. They were not created by fashion designers searching for a new trend. Long before high heels became associated with women, they belonged to a completely different world. They belonged to powerful men. They belonged to soldiers. They belonged to wealthy horse riders. They belonged to kings.
if someone from the modern world suddenly walked into a royal court 400 years ago, they would probably think they had entered another reality. The men would be wearing colorful clothing covered with expensive decorations. Many would have long, curled wigs. Some would wear makeup. Many would wear silk stockings, and a surprising number of them would be wearing high heels. Not secretly, not as a joke, not as a rare exception. They wore them proudly because high heels were considered a symbol of status and importance. Don't miss the stories no one else dares to tell. Subscribe now. The higher a man's position in society, the more likely he was to wear them. This creates a strange problem for modern people. We often assume fashion moves in a straight line. We imagine that an object means roughly the same thing throughout history. We assume a suit has always represented professionalism. We assume a wedding ring has always represented marriage. We assume high heels have always been connected to women. History rarely works that way. The meaning of objects changes constantly. Sometimes those changes happen so gradually that people barely notice them. Then several centuries pass, and the original meaning disappears completely. High heels are one of the best examples of this process. Today they communicate one message. Hundreds of years ago they communicated something completely different. The shoe itself changed very little. Society changed around it. One reason people misunderstand this story is because they imagine fashion as something separate from power. In reality, fashion has often been one of the clearest ways to display power. Before social media, before television, before photographs, clothing sent messages instantly. People could often tell who was rich, who was important, and who had influence simply by looking at them. Expensive fabrics sent a message. Jewelry sent a message. Special colors sent a message. Shoes sent a message. High heels eventually became part of that language. They told the world that the person wearing them belonged to a privileged group. That message became so valuable that powerful people actively protected it. In some places, clothing rules controlled who could wear certain materials, colors, and accessories. Fashion was not just about appearance. It was about social rank. It was about separating ordinary people from elites. That separation became extremely important as wealthy families competed for status and influence. The result was a strange competition where people constantly searched for new ways to display their importance. High heels became one of the most visible symbols in that competition. The story becomes even stranger when famous rulers enter the picture. One of the most powerful kings in European history became obsessed with controlling his image. He understood something many modern politicians and celebrities understand very well.
People often believe what they see. If a ruler looked powerful, many people assumed he was powerful. If a ruler looked wealthy, many people assumed he was wealthy. Appearance could shape reputation. Reputation could shape authority. Authority could shape history. That ruler was Louis XIV of France. Today, he is remembered as one of the most famous monarchs in history. What many people do not realize is that he was also one of the most influential fashion trendsetters who ever lived. Louis XIV loved high heels. He wore them regularly and helped transform them into a symbol of elite status throughout Europe. His shoes often featured striking red heels that became closely associated with power and privilege. When nobles saw the king wearing something, many rushed to imitate him. As a result, high heels spread even further through the upper levels of society. What began as a practical object slowly evolved into a symbol of prestige. Yet, even this explanation only tells part of the story.
The deeper mystery remains hidden beneath the surface. Why did powerful men become interested in heels in the first place? Why would a shoe designed with a raised heel appeal to warriors, rulers, and aristocrats? Why did generations of men proudly wear something that most people today view completely differently? The answer has almost nothing to do with fashion and almost everything to do with a practical problem that existed centuries earlier. The origin of high heels leads away from royal palaces and luxury lifestyles. It leads toward horse riders, military needs, and a simple solution that nobody expected would change fashion history. The deeper we go into this story, the stranger it becomes, because the people who helped create the high heel were not trying to change fashion, they were trying to solve a problem. In the process, they accidentally created one of the most recognizable items the world has ever seen. To understand why high heels existed at all, we need to leave royal palaces behind and travel much farther east. The story begins centuries before European kings turned heels into fashion statements. It begins with a problem that had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with survival. During the 16th century, Persia was one of the most powerful states in the region. Its rulers depended heavily on skilled cavalry forces. These horsemen were not simply soldiers riding into battle with swords. Many were trained to use bows while moving at high speed. This required an unusual combination of balance, accuracy, and control. A rider often needed to rise slightly while standing in the stirrups. That movement created a serious challenge. If the foot slipped forward, the rider could lose stability at exactly the wrong moment. In battle, even a small mistake could become deadly. The solution was surprisingly simple. A raised heel helped keep the foot locked inside the stirrup.
Instead of sliding forward, the rider gained a more secure position. The heel acted almost like a small anchor. It was not designed to make someone look taller. It was not designed to attract attention. It was designed because it worked. Thousands of horsemen relied on equipment that increased their control while riding. The shoe became part of a larger military system built around mobility and effectiveness. What makes this story unusual is that almost nobody using these heels considered them fashionable. They were practical tools. Their value came from performance rather than appearance. Modern people often imagine fashion and technology as completely different things. In reality, many famous fashion items began as solutions to practical problems. Jeans were created for durability. Sunglasses protected the eyes. Wristwatches became useful military tools before becoming everyday accessories. High heels followed a similar path. They started as equipment.
The transformation into fashion came much later. During this period, Persia attracted growing attention from Europe. Trade expanded, diplomats traveled between regions, political alliances became increasingly important. European visitors encountered Persian culture and observed things that seemed impressive and exotic. Among the many details they noticed were the clothes and footwear worn by Persian horsemen and elites. This happened during a period when European nobles constantly searched for new ways to display sophistication and status. Foreign styles often attracted attention because they appeared unusual and prestigious. A wealthy noble could signal knowledge, influence, and worldliness by adopting trends connected to distant cultures. As a result, elements of Persian style gradually entered European fashion. What started as admiration slowly became imitation.
The shoe that had helped cavalry riders maintain stability began appearing in places where nobody needed to fire arrows from horseback. Yet the original meaning remained important. Owning horses was expensive. Maintaining horses was expensive. Riding itself often signaled wealth and privilege. When heels became associated with horse riding, they also became associated with status. This connection helped change the meaning of the shoe. A practical tool was becoming a social symbol.
That transformation accelerated because European society was deeply divided by class. Wealthy families constantly searched for visible ways to separate themselves from ordinary people. Clothing became one of the easiest methods. Expensive fabrics communicated status immediately. Decorative accessories communicated status immediately. Distinctive shoes communicated status immediately. High heels fit perfectly into this system.
They were unusual enough to attract attention and distinctive enough to signal membership in elite circles. Something fascinating happened as this process continued. The further the shoe moved away from its military purpose, the more people focused on its symbolic value. The original problem that created the heel gradually faded from memory. New generations saw the shoe without understanding why it existed. They simply knew that influential people wore it. Once that happened, fashion took control of the story. Designs became more elaborate, heels became more noticeable, social meaning became more important than practical function. Yet traces of the original purpose still remained hidden beneath the surface. Every raised heel carried the legacy of mounted warriors, even when the wearer had never sat on a horse. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. An invention solves one problem and later acquires a completely different meaning. Sometimes the new meaning becomes so dominant that people forget the original purpose entirely. High heels became one of the clearest examples of that process. By the time many European nobles embraced them, the shoe was already beginning a second life. The first life belonged to soldiers and riders. The second life belonged to status and appearance. That shift changed everything. Once an object becomes a status symbol, powerful people compete to control it. Wealthy people compete to display it. Designers compete to reinvent it. The shoe entered a world where appearance often mattered more than practicality. This created a chain reaction that nobody could have predicted when Persian riders first used raised heels to secure their feet. The transformation was still only beginning. The next stage would push high heels even further from their original purpose. A powerful king would adopt them. Entire royal courts would copy them. Political influence would become connected to footwear.
The shoe would stop being known for what it did and start being known for what it represented. That moment would turn a practical military solution into one of the most recognizable status symbols in history. By the early 17th century, high heels were moving through Europe in a way nobody could have predicted. The shoe had already traveled far from the horsemen who helped popularize it. What began as a practical riding tool was entering a completely different environment. In royal courts, wealthy families competed constantly for attention, influence, and prestige. Every detail mattered. Clothing mattered. Jewelry mattered. Hairstyles mattered. Even the shape of a shoe could communicate social rank. High heels arrived at exactly the right moment. Europe was filled with nobles searching for ways to stand apart from ordinary people. Expensive clothing was one solution. Imported goods were another. Unusual fashion choices became powerful social signals.
The heel fit perfectly into this system because it looked distinctive and immediately attracted attention. The most important thing was not comfort. The most important thing was status. The stranger the fashion appeared to ordinary people, the more valuable it often became among elites. Throughout history, wealthy groups have repeatedly adopted styles that make daily life less practical. Large powdered wigs required constant maintenance. Elaborate clothing restricted movement. Decorative accessories added little practical value. Yet these items communicated something important. They told everyone that the wearer had enough money to ignore practicality. High heels gradually entered the same category. They became symbols of privilege rather than necessity. A nobleman did not need to explain his position. His appearance already delivered the message. As this trend spread, another strange change occurred. The original connection between heels and horse riding became less important. Many men wearing heels had no military purpose in mind. They wore them because other influential men wore them. Fashion was creating its own momentum. One generation copied the previous generation. Soon people stopped asking why the trend existed. They only cared that it signaled importance. The shoe was becoming disconnected from its original function. This process accelerated because European courts were highly competitive social environments. Hundreds of nobles might spend years trying to gain favor with rulers. Every advantage mattered. Every opportunity to appear important mattered. Fashion became part of that competition. Standing out could attract attention. Attention could create opportunities. Opportunities could lead to influence. Influence could lead to wealth. Something as simple as footwear became connected to social advancement. Then a powerful new figure entered the story and changed everything. His name was Louis XIV.
He would eventually become one of the most famous rulers in European history. He understood power better than most people around him. He also understood image better than most rulers before him. Louis knew that appearances shaped public perception. He carefully managed how people saw him. Every detail of royal life became part of a larger performance. Clothing played a major role in that strategy. The king wanted to appear impressive, powerful, and above everyone else. High heels became one of the tools he used to achieve that goal. Louis XIV was not especially tall. In a society that often connected height with authority, that mattered. Heels offered a simple solution. They added height while also making the wearer appear more commanding. The king embraced them enthusiastically. Soon his footwear became famous throughout Europe. His shoes often featured bright red heels that immediately attracted attention. The color itself became associated with status and royal favor.
The result was remarkable. Noblemen across France rushed to imitate the king. Many believed that copying his appearance could help them gain influence within the royal court. This was not simply fashion, it was social strategy. Looking like the king carried political value. The closer a nobleman appeared to royal tastes, the more seriously he might be taken. Louis XIV transformed fashion into a system of control. Thousands of nobles became obsessed with court rules, royal approval, and appearance. The king effectively turned style into a tool of power. High heels became one of the clearest symbols of that system. The irony was remarkable. A shoe originally connected to military practicality had become part of a political performance. Yet the transformation was still not complete. The popularity of heels continued growing across Europe. Other rulers adopted similar styles. Other courts followed similar trends. Men of influence increasingly viewed heels as normal parts of elite fashion. Portraits from the period reveal a world that feels surprising to modern viewers. Powerful men stand confidently in decorated clothing, silk stockings, elaborate wigs, and noticeable heels. To them, nothing about this appearance seemed unusual. In fact, many considered it ideal. Modern assumptions about masculinity simply did not exist in the same form. Status mattered more than simplicity. Display mattered more than restraint. Wealth mattered more than practicality. This helps explain why high heels thrived during this period. They fit perfectly within existing ideas about power and prestige. Looking impressive was often more important than looking practical. The higher a person's position, the more elaborate his appearance could become. Yet hidden beneath this success was a problem that nobody fully recognized. Fashion trends survive only while society values the ideas behind them. High heels had become symbols of status because society admired visible displays of wealth and privilege. If those values changed, the meaning of the shoe could change as well. Few people noticed the warning signs at first. The trend appeared stronger than ever. Kings wore heels, nobles wore heels, influential men wore heels. The connection between masculinity and high heels seemed completely secure. Yet deep social changes were already beginning to reshape Europe. New ideas about work, reason, and status were spreading. New attitudes toward wealth and appearance were emerging. These changes would eventually challenge everything that high heels represented. The same object that had helped powerful men display authority would soon face an unexpected crisis. The rise of high heels had been dramatic. Their fall from men's fashion would prove even more surprising. The story of high heels could have ended inside royal courts.
They could have remained nothing more than an expensive trend worn by wealthy men trying to impress other wealthy men. Instead, something much bigger happened. Once kings and nobles accepted heels as symbols of status, the idea began spreading through society in ways nobody expected. The shoe was no longer connected to a single purpose. It was becoming part of a larger system that shaped how people displayed power, wealth, and social position. Every generation added new meanings to the same object. Every new meaning pushed the shoe further away from its original purpose. What began as a solution for horse riders was turning into a symbol understood across entire countries. During the late 17th century and early 18th century, appearance became increasingly important among Europe's upper classes. Wealthy families invested enormous amounts of money into clothing, accessories, and personal presentation. Looking important was often almost as valuable as being important.
In many social circles, appearance influenced opportunities, relationships, and political influence. A person who appeared successful often gained advantages before speaking a single word. Fashion became a language. Every item communicated information. High heels communicated status. Expensive fabrics communicated status. Decorative clothing communicated status. Together they created a visual system that helped define social hierarchy. Yet this system created its own problems. The more people adopted elite fashion, the harder it became for elites to stand apart. Wealthy families constantly searched for new ways to maintain distinction. This created a cycle of change. Trends spread downward through society, Elites responded by adopting new trends. The process repeated again and again. High heels became trapped inside this cycle. Their popularity created demand. Demand created wider adoption. Wider adoption reduced exclusivity. Reduced exclusivity encouraged further changes. The shoe was constantly evolving because society itself was evolving. Then another unexpected development appeared. High heels gradually became taller and more decorative. Practicality became less important than visual impact. Designers focused increasingly on appearance rather than function. The shoe was becoming a statement piece. The transformation reflected a larger cultural shift. Many people wearing heels no longer cared about the original purpose behind them. They cared about what the shoe communicated. The message mattered more than the history. This pattern appears throughout human history. Once an object acquires symbolic value, symbolism often becomes more important than practicality. The same thing happened with crowns, jewelry, luxury watches, and expensive cars. Their usefulness becomes secondary. Their meaning becomes primary. High heels followed the same path. Yet beneath the surface, powerful social forces were beginning to challenge everything they represented. Across Europe, ideas about work and success were changing. More people began respecting business, science, and productivity. Wealth was increasingly connected to commerce rather than inherited privilege. New groups of successful people emerged outside traditional aristocratic circles. Their values often differed from those of older elites. Simplicity gradually became more respectable in certain environments. Practicality began gaining importance. This shift did not happen overnight. It developed slowly across generations. At first, few people noticed the long-term consequences. Fashion trends still appeared secure. Noblemen still wore heels. Court life still celebrated elaborate appearance. Yet the foundation beneath that world was changing. New attitudes toward masculinity were also emerging. Increasingly, some influential thinkers associated seriousness with restraint. They associated professionalism with simplicity. They associated authority with practicality. These ideas conflicted with older traditions that emphasized decoration and display. The conflict grew stronger over time. High heels found themselves caught between two competing visions of manhood. One vision celebrated visible status and elaborate appearance. The other emphasized practicality, discipline, and self-control. The shoe represented the older system. That connection would eventually become a problem. Another unexpected consequence emerged from this transformation. Women had already begun adopting certain styles previously associated with elite men. Fashion constantly borrowed ideas across social groups. Once high heels became established symbols of status, they naturally attracted wider interest. Some women incorporated heels into their own wardrobes. At first, this did not seem revolutionary. Fashion borrowing happened frequently. Yet over time, this small shift would become incredibly important. The same object was beginning to acquire different meanings depending on who wore it. The process was subtle. Most people living through it probably did not notice. Yet history was moving toward a major turning point. One of the strangest aspects of this story is how invisible these changes appeared while they were happening. Nobody gathered in a room and decided that high heels should stop being associated with men. Nobody announced that the meaning of the shoe would change forever. Instead, thousands of individual decisions gradually pushed society in a new direction. Some men adopted simpler styles. Some women adopted heels. Designers responded to changing tastes. Cultural values shifted slowly across decades. The result was a chain reaction nobody controlled. The shoe itself remained largely recognizable. Society kept assigning it new meanings. By the middle of the 18th century, the transformation was accelerating. Ideas that once seemed permanent suddenly looked less secure. Fashion that once symbolized authority began appearing old-fashioned to some observers. Traditional displays of status faced growing criticism. New standards were replacing old ones. High heels stood directly in the path of these changes. For generations, they had represented power. For generations, they had represented privilege. For generations, they had represented elite masculinity. Now the forces reshaping society were preparing to challenge each of those meanings. The next stage of the story would be even stranger. The object that helped powerful men display authority would slowly lose its place in men's fashion. At the same time, it would find a completely new identity elsewhere. What followed was not simply a fashion trend. It was one of the most dramatic shifts in the cultural meaning of an everyday object. The same shoe that once symbolized kings, soldiers, and noblemen was about to begin an entirely different chapter. One of the strangest parts of the high heel story is that the people living through it probably never noticed how unusual it was. Modern audiences often look at old paintings and immediately focus on the shoes. They see men wearing heels and assume they are looking at some rare exception. In reality, those images reflected a world where ideas about masculinity were very different from those of today. A wealthy man in the 17th century could wear bright colors, expensive jewelry, decorated clothing, long wigs, and high heels without damaging his reputation. In many cases, those items strengthened his reputation. They showed wealth, status, and influence. What seems surprising now looked completely normal then. This becomes even stranger when we examine how much effort elite men invested in appearance. Some noblemen spent enormous amounts of money on clothing and accessories. Fashion was not a side interest, it was a serious social tool. Looking successful helped communicate success. Looking powerful helped communicate power. Appearance shaped first impressions long before modern advertising existed. In some circles, clothing functioned almost like a public announcement of social rank. Every detail carried meaning. High heels were only one piece of a much larger system, yet they became one of the most visible symbols of that world. Another surprising detail comes from portraits of European rulers and aristocrats. Many paintings that survive from the period show men standing in poses that modern viewers often associate with fashion photography. Artists carefully emphasized clothing, posture, and footwear. The goal was not simply to record a person's appearance. The goal was to communicate authority. High heels helped create that image. They added height and presence. They helped transform the body into a visual statement. This was especially valuable in societies where power depended heavily on perception. The stronger a ruler appeared, the stronger he often seemed politically. Yet the story becomes even more unusual when women entered the picture. As high heels became established among elites, women also began wearing versions of them. At first, the difference between men's heels and women's heels was not always dramatic. Both groups borrowed ideas from each other. Fashion moved in multiple directions. Certain styles crossed social boundaries. Certain styles crossed gender boundaries. The modern assumption that fashion categories are fixed simply did not apply in the same way. This created a period where heels existed in both worlds simultaneously. Men wore them, women wore them. The meanings sometimes overlapped and sometimes differed. The situation was far more complicated than most people imagine. Another forgotten detail involves the shape of the heels themselves. Many early heels looked very different from modern designs. Some were thicker and built for stability. Others emphasized visual impact over comfort. There was no single standard design. Fashion changed constantly. Designers experimented with different shapes and proportions. The high heel evolved repeatedly as tastes shifted. What remained consistent was the social message attached to it. The shoe continued signaling status and distinction. That symbolic value remained far more important than any specific design feature. One of the most interesting examples comes from the way fashion trends spread across Europe. When influential rulers adopted a style, neighboring courts often followed. Nobles copied kings, regional elites copied nobles, merchants copied elites whenever possible. Fashion moved through society like a chain reaction. A trend that began in one court could appear hundreds of miles away within a surprisingly short time. High heels benefited from this process. Their popularity expanded because influential people kept reinforcing their importance. Every new adopter increased their visibility. Every new admirer strengthened their cultural value. Yet the very success of high heels created an unexpected weakness. The more closely they became associated with elite fashion, the more vulnerable they became to changes in social attitudes. When people admire aristocratic lifestyles, aristocratic fashion thrives. When people begin questioning aristocratic values, aristocratic fashion becomes a target. This problem slowly emerged during the 18th century. New ideas spread across Europe. Thinkers increasingly praised reason, discipline, and productivity. Wealthy merchants gained influence. Scientific achievement gained respect. Practical success became more admired. As these values grew stronger, some older fashion traditions began looking excessive. Elaborate clothing appeared less impressive to certain observers. Decorative styles attracted criticism. High heels became caught in that shift. What once symbolized power started looking unnecessary to some people. Another hidden twist appeared during this same period. Men and women did not abandon decorative fashion at the same speed. This difference would become incredibly important. Many men gradually moved towards simpler clothing. Darker colors became more common. Practical designs became more respected. Decorative elements slowly disappeared from many male wardrobes. Women, however, continued wearing many fashion items that men were beginning to reject. This included heels. The change happened gradually enough that few people recognized its significance, yet a major cultural shift was taking place. The same object was slowly acquiring different meanings depending on who continued wearing it.
The process was so slow that it almost appeared invisible. A generation passed, then another generation passed. Small changes accumulated. Eventually, the results became impossible to ignore. What had once been a symbol of elite masculinity was moving in a completely different direction. One of history's most successful fashion symbols was changing identities.
The strangest part is that nobody planned it. No designer created a strategy. No ruler issued a command. Millions of individual choices slowly reshaped the meaning of the shoe. The object remained recognizable. The culture surrounding it transformed. By the end of the 18th century, a person transported from the age of Louis XIV would have struggled to understand what was happening. The rules had changed. The values had changed. The appearance of powerful men had changed. High heels were no longer standing at the center of male status in the way they once had.
A transformation that began with horse riders and kings was entering its final stage. The object that helped define elite men for generations was preparing to leave their world almost entirely. The next chapter would complete one of the most surprising reversals in fashion history. By the beginning of the 19th century, something remarkable had happened. High heels had not disappeared from the world. They had disappeared from one specific place. They had largely disappeared from men's fashion. This change seems simple when viewed from the modern world. In reality, it represented one of the largest cultural shifts in the history of clothing. For centuries, powerful men had worn heels without hesitation. Kings wore them, nobles wore them, military officers wore them, wealthy horse riders wore them. Then, over time, men began abandoning not only heels, but many other decorative fashion items as well. Bright colors became less common. Heavy decoration became less common. Makeup became less common. Jewelry became less common. Elaborate clothing slowly gave way to simpler styles. Historians sometimes describe this change as one of the most important transformations in men's fashion. Yet the story reaches far beyond clothing. It reflected a broader shift in how society viewed masculinity itself. Earlier generations often associated power with visible displays of wealth. A powerful man was expected to look important. His clothing communicated status. His appearance communicated influence. By the 19th century, new ideas were taking hold. Increasingly, successful men wanted to appear practical, disciplined, and productive. Simplicity became a sign of seriousness. Decorative fashion started looking less masculine in many social circles. The old rules were being replaced. This change affected millions of people across Europe and eventually beyond it. The impact reached business, politics, education, and public life. A man's appearance increasingly reflected values such as restraint and professionalism. The shift happened gradually, but its consequences were enormous. High heels became one of its most visible casualties. The shoe had become too closely associated with the older world of aristocratic display. As that world lost influence, the shoe lost influence among men. Yet this was only half of the story. While many men were abandoning heels, women continued wearing them. This created a dramatic separation that had not existed in the same way before. An object once shared by both sexes was slowly becoming associated with only one. The process unfolded across generations, rather than years. Many people never noticed the transition while it was happening. They simply adapted to changing trends. The long-term result, however, was extraordinary. A shoe that once symbolized male authority gradually became linked to femininity. The same object carried completely different meanings depending on the era. This transformation reveals something important about culture. People often treat social rules as permanent truths. They assume current norms have always existed. High heels prove how misleading that assumption can be. Their meaning changed dramatically despite the object itself remaining recognizable. Society rewrote the story around the shoe. As industrialization expanded during the 19th century, the transformation accelerated further. Large cities grew rapidly. New industries emerged. Millions of people entered new forms of work. Daily life became increasingly structured around factories, offices, transportation systems, and business institutions. Clothing adapted to these realities. Practicality gained even greater importance. Men working in professional environments often preferred styles that appeared efficient and functional. Decorative footwear fit less naturally into that world. High heels continued moving away from male wardrobes. At the same time, fashion for women evolved along a different path. Designers explored new silhouettes, new materials, and new ways of shaping appearance. High heels remained useful because they altered posture and changed the visual proportions of the body. Their symbolic meaning continued evolving. They no longer communicated military skill. They no longer communicated aristocratic privilege in the same way. Instead, they became integrated into changing ideas about beauty and fashion. Another fascinating twist appeared during the 20th century. Mass media dramatically increased the influence of fashion trends. Magazines, advertisements, films, and later television exposed millions of people to the same images. This helped strengthen the connection between high heels and femininity. Popular culture reinforced the association repeatedly. New generations grew up seeing heels presented primarily through female fashion.
The older history slowly faded from public memory. By this point, the original story was nearly forgotten. Most people never learned about Persian horsemen. Most people never learned about European kings wearing heels. Most people never learned that high heels had once been considered symbols of male authority. The past disappeared beneath layers of newer meanings. This is one reason the modern reaction to historical portraits feels so surprising. People look at paintings from earlier centuries and struggle to understand what they are seeing. The image clashes with modern expectations, yet the people in those paintings would likely be equally confused by modern assumptions. Each generation tends to believe its own social rules are natural and permanent. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. High heels reveal how quickly cultural meanings can shift. The object remained recognizable while society transformed around it.
The story also shows how inventions often escape the control of their creators. The horsemen who benefited from raised heels never intended to influence global fashion. The nobles who copied foreign styles never intended to redefine gender expectations. The kings who used heels as symbols of authority never intended to help create future fashion trends. Every group contributed something to the story. None of them controlled the final outcome. The results spread across continents and centuries. A simple design feature traveled through military history, royal politics, social competition, industrial change, and mass media. Very few everyday objects have experienced such a dramatic transformation. Even fewer reveal so much about the way societies assign meaning to things. By the modern era, high heels had become one of the most recognizable fashion items on Earth. Yet hidden inside every pair remained traces of a forgotten history. The world remembered the shoe. The world largely forgot how the journey began. That forgotten journey reveals a much larger truth. The history of high heels is not really about shoes. It is about how entire societies can completely change the meaning of an object while leaving the object itself almost untouched. When most people look at a pair of high heels today, they see a fashion item. They see something connected to style, appearance, and modern culture. Few people stop and think about how far that object has traveled through history. Even fewer realize that almost every stage of its journey carried a completely different meaning. That is what makes this story so unusual. The object itself remained surprisingly familiar, while society kept rewriting the story around it. The heel changed the world not because of what it was, but because of what people believed it represented. The journey began with a practical problem. Horse riders needed better stability while using stirrups. A raised heel helped solve that problem. The solution worked. It improved control and made riding more secure. At that moment, nobody was thinking about fashion history. Nobody was thinking about status symbols. Nobody was thinking about future ideas of masculinity and femininity. People were simply solving a problem. Yet history often works this way. Small solutions sometimes create consequences that nobody can predict. Once the heel left the world of horse riding, it entered the world of social status. Wealthy people adopted it because it carried prestige. Nobles adopted it because other nobles wore it. Kings adopted it because it reinforced their image. Every new group attached another layer of meaning to the same object. The practical purpose became less important. The symbolic purpose became more important. Eventually, the symbol became so powerful that people forgot the original reason the heel existed. That transformation reveals something important about human behavior. People often believe they are choosing objects for practical reasons. In reality, they are frequently choosing meanings. A watch tells time, but it can also communicate status. A car provides transportation, but it can also communicate success. Clothing covers the body, but it can also communicate identity. High heels followed the same pattern. The shoe became a canvas onto which different societies projected different ideas. Another fascinating part of the story is how completely cultural meanings can change. Modern people often assume that social norms have deep roots stretching far into the past. They imagine that today's expectations have always existed. High heels show how misleading that assumption can be. There was a time when powerful men wore them proudly. There was a time when kings considered them symbols of authority. There was a time when elite masculinity and high heels were closely connected. Today, many people find that difficult to imagine, yet future generations may look at modern customs with the same surprise. The rules that seem permanent now may appear strange centuries from today. History repeatedly demonstrates that cultural meanings are far less stable than people assume. The story also reveals how little control individuals have over the long-term impact of their actions. Persian writers did not intend to influence European fashion. European nobles did not intend to reshape ideas about gender. Louis XIV did not intend to help create a future fashion symbol associated mainly with women. Every group contributed something. None of them controlled the final result. The story unfolded through countless decisions made across hundreds of years. The final outcome emerged gradually from those decisions. Nobody planned it, nobody directed it, yet the result transformed global culture. Another lesson hides inside this journey. History is often presented as a story of wars, governments, and major events. Those subjects matter, but everyday objects can reveal just as much about how societies change. A simple shoe can expose shifts in power, status, economics, fashion, identity, and culture. Sometimes the most ordinary objects preserve the most surprising stories. High heels are a perfect example. At first glance, they seem familiar. Once their history is uncovered, they become something entirely different. They become evidence of how quickly societies can redefine meaning. They become evidence of how cultural assumptions rise and fall. They become evidence of how the past continues shaping the present in ways people rarely notice. The strangest part is that the shoe never needed to change very much. The heel remained a heel. Leather became different. Materials improved. Designs evolved. Yet the basic idea survived. What changed was everything surrounding it. Different generations looked at the same object and saw completely different things. One generation saw military usefulness.
Another saw aristocratic privilege. Another saw royal authority. Another saw fashion. Another saw femininity. The object stayed recognizable while its meaning transformed repeatedly. Very few items illustrate that process so clearly. This is why the history of high heels is much larger than fashion. It is really a story about how humans create meaning. It is a story about how status symbols emerge. It is a story about how cultural rules evolve. Most importantly, it is a reminder that many things people consider natural are actually temporary. The world often feels stable because change happens slowly. Yet when centuries are compressed into a single story, the transformation becomes impossible to miss. A shoe that began with horse riders crossed continents, entered royal palaces, shaped elite culture, survived political change, adapted to new social values, and eventually became one of the most recognizable fashion items on Earth.
That entire journey began with a simple, practical solution. The next time someone sees a pair of high heels, they are not just looking at a fashion accessory. They are looking at the descendant of a military tool, a royal status symbol, and one of history's most unexpected cultural transformations. The shoe remains familiar. The story behind it is far stranger than most people ever imagine.